All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going deep on anarchism.
Anarchism.
Yeah, anarchism. I mean, you hear that word and, maybe you think chaos, maybe you think, Molotov cocktails.
Yeah.
But, when you really dig into it, it's a lot more nuanced, a lot more interesting than just, kind of breaking stuff. It's really about, skepticism of authority and power, especially, the power of the state.
Right, right. It's not just destruction. There's also this real deep commitment to individual freedom, like the freedom to live your life without being dominated by some kind of authority. And along with that, you often see these really positive ideals,
Yeah, totally.
like equality, community, making decisions together without forcing anyone.
Right. So it's not just like a political program. It's not just like, here's how we overthrew the government.
Yeah.
It's also a whole, like, theoretical framework
Hmm.
that connects with so many different philosophical ideas, even questioning some of our most basic assumptions about knowledge and like, what makes something legit.
Exactly. And for you, with your philosophical background, that's what makes anarchism so fascinating. I mean, you've been working through all these foundational texts in political thought, and now we're running into something that's like directly challenging those foundations. We're going to dig into all the different forms anarchism takes and really unpack those core arguments.
Yeah, give you a clearer understanding. I think a lot of people misunderstand what anarchism is really about.
Right.
So let's get started. So, one of the first things we got to do is talk about the different varieties of anarchism because there are a lot.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right.
There's a bunch. So maybe the obvious starting point is political anarchism, which is probably what most people think of first when they hear the word.
Yeah.
And the term itself, anarchism, comes from the Greek prefix an, meaning without, and arche, which basically means like a first principle, a foundation, or ruling power.
Like the archon, like the ruler.
Exactly. So anarchy basically means without a ruler, without a ruling principle, rule by no one.
Okay, but that sounds like chaos to a lot of people. I mean, what happens when there's no one in charge?
Well, some theorists, like de Pruderi, they suggest that this absence of a ruler, it can also mean that everyone rules,
Okay, interesting.
right? Through consensus, through unanimous agreement.
So instead of one person making decisions, everyone has to agree.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, that sounds really challenging on a large scale.
Yeah.
Like, how do you get everyone to agree on anything?
Yeah, that's a big question for anarchists.
We'll get to that. But so political anarchists, like you said, they're focused on the state. What is it about the state that they see as so problematic?
Well, the main critique is about power. They see state power as centralized, monopolistic, coercive.
You only have one state. The state has a monopoly on violence, and it can force you to do stuff.
Exactly. And they see that kind of power as inherently illegitimate.
Okay, so it's not just that they don't like this particular government or this particular law.
Right.
It's the very idea of a state, of a centralized power that can force people to obey
Yeah.
that they have a problem with.
Exactly.
And there are some really powerful articulations of this critique, throughout history.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, Bakunin, right?
Yeah.
He's one of the big names in anarchism. And he argued that a state can't exist without domination.
Yeah.
One class dominating another, which he saw as a form of slavery,
Yeah, he famously said that a state without slavery is unthinkable.
which is a pretty fundamental challenge to any kind of, like, traditional political organization.
It is. It is. It really cuts to the core of how we think about power and legitimacy.
Now, this isn't just some historical relic either. Like,
Yeah.
you've got contemporary thinkers making these same arguments.
Right. You've got Gerard Casey, who actually argues that all states, no matter how they're structured, what their goals are, they're basically criminal organizations.
Whoa. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. It is. And, these are obviously big generalizations.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that anarchism is a diverse philosophy. And different anarchists might have different critiques of specific state formations.
Right, because states have been organized in so many different ways throughout history.
Exactly. And political power isn't always, this unified thing.
It's not always some evil dictator, twirling his mustache.
Right. And the historical context also matters. I mean, Bakunin was writing in the context of, 19th century socialist movements,
Right.
engaging with Marx, with Hegel.
And Casey is writing, in our current context with globalization, neoliberalism, all that.
Mm.
So their critiques are going to be shaped by those different contexts.
Right. So some anarchists might want to get rid of all political power completely,
Right.
while others might focus on specific institutions or practices that they see as particularly oppressive.
Exactly. It's a spectrum. It's a spectrum. Okay, so
Yes.
that's political anarchism. But like the anarchist critique doesn't stop there, right? It extends beyond just politics.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, it extends to the rejection of any kind of centralized authority, even those that aren't explicitly political.
So we're talking about religion, family, culture, all that.
Yeah, all of that. I mean, Bakunin, who we were just talking about, he also had a lot to say about religion.
Right. I mean, he famously said, if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. It's
Exactly.
like a pretty strong statement. He's not messing around.
No, he wasn't. And, it might seem paradoxical, but there are actually religious forms of anarchism that use religious ideas to critique political authority.
Okay, so it's not about rejecting spirituality or the divine, but it's about questioning the legitimacy of earthly power structures based on some higher principle.
Exactly. So, for example, you have Taoism, which has been explored by Rapp, in its critique of the state and its focus on living in harmony with nature, free from artificial social constraints.
So it's more about living in accordance with some kind of natural order.
Yeah, and Ramnath has actually identified anarchist elements in a bunch of different religious traditions,
But what?
like Islamic Sufism, Hindu Bhakti movements with their rejection of caste hierarchies,
Right.
Sikhism's emphasis on equality,
Okay.
and even some interpretations of Buddhism. But maybe the most well-known example is Christian anarchism.
Yeah, and they're the ones who really take this critique of the state and connect it to religious ideas.
Right. They often see the kingdom of God as this separate realm, completely different from and often opposed to any kind of human-made political order.
Right, so the true authority comes from God, not from some earthly king or president.
Exactly. And they're often very critical of the church as an institution, too.
Okay, so it's not just about separating religion from the state, it's also about questioning the power structures within religious institutions themselves.
Yeah.
And Tolstoy is a big name here, right?
Oh, huge. He argued that being a true Christian means disobeying the state. Yeah. He refused to pledge allegiance to any political authority. And he was a staunch pacifist, believing that the state is inherently tied to violence and war.
So for him, being a Christian meant rejecting any kind of participation in violence.
Exactly. And, not all Christian anarchists are pacifists.
Okay, so there's some diversity there.
Oh, yeah. You have someone like Berdiev, who was actually inspired by Tolstoy, who famously said, "The kingdom of God is anarchy."
Whoa. So even within Christian anarchism, there are different interpretations of what that means in practice.
Absolutely.
And some Christian anarchists have taken this even further, like forming separatist communities.
Oh, yeah.
Right, like trying to live completely outside of any state structure.
Yeah.
We see this historically with the New England transcendentalists like Garrison and Ballou.
Right.
They were really influential for Tolstoy. And then you have, more recently, people like Peter Morin and Dorothy Day.
Yeah, with the Catholic worker movement. And then, of course, you have Jacques Ellul, who had this really, really comprehensive critique of power. He saw Christian anarchism as being against nationalism, capitalism, even democracy.
Whoa.
He thought we needed to overturn all kinds of authorities, even refusing to vote.
So it's not just about being against the state. It's about rejecting any kind of system or structure that relies on unjustified authority.
Exactly. It's a radical stance.
Okay, so we've got political anarchism, we've got religious anarchism,
Yay.
and then there's this other thing, right? Theoretical anarchism.
Yeah, theoretical anarchism. And this is where things get really interesting, especially from a philosophical perspective.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So theoretical anarchism is about applying these anarchist critiques to epistemology, philosophy of science, literary theory. It's about questioning the very foundations of how we know and understand the world.
So instead of just focusing on political power, it's about challenging the ways in which we create knowledge and meaning.
Exactly. And you have someone like William James, the American pragmatist, who actually described his own philosophy as a form of anarchism.
Interesting. So how did he connect those two things?
Well, pragmatism is all about rejecting these grand, systematic philosophical systems.
Right. It's about focusing on what works, what's practical.
Exactly. And in a way, it's about giving up on the search for some ultimate foundation, some arche that explains everything.
Okay, so it's like saying we don't need one big answer, one big system. We just need to figure out what works in specific situations.
Yeah, and that approach can be seen as quite anarchistic.
And this kind of thinking continues, right?
Uh-huh.
Like with post-structuralism and postmodernism,
Right.
they're also kind of anarchistic in their own way.
They are. They're deconstructing power, questioning essential truths. They're undermining the whole idea that there's one right way to understand things.
And then you have post-anarchism, which takes this even further.
Yeah, it's like a more recent, more fluid version that's really digging into the way power operates at like a deeper level.
So it's not just about overturning the state or any specific institution. It's about challenging the very structures of thought and language that create and maintain power.
Exactly. And that creates this really interesting tension between, this kind of post-anarchism and more traditional anarchism.
Now so.
Well, traditional anarchists were often focused on political action, actually trying to dismantle the state.
Yeah.
And they were often grounded in these fundamental principles like individual autonomy.
Right, like we have a right to be free, we have a right to self-determination.
Exactly. But post-anarchism, it even questions those principles. It's like a deeper level of skepticism.
So it's like saying even our ideas about freedom and autonomy might be shaped by power structures that we need to unpack.
Exactly. It's a more radical critique.
Okay, so we've got anarchism in politics, religion, even these really abstract theoretical realms.
Right.
But how does this translate into real-world critiques of, actual social problems like inequality and oppression?
Well, that's where we get into applied anarchism.
Applied anarchism.
Yeah. So the idea here is that the anarchist critique of unjustified authority, it can be applied to all sorts of social hierarchies and systems of domination.
So we're not just talking about the state anymore. We're talking about patriarchy,
Right.
racism, environmental destruction, all that.
Yeah, all of that. And in recent decades, we've seen anarchist principles being applied to all sorts of movements.
Like what?
Like anarcho-feminism, which analyzes patriarchy through an anarchist lens.
Okay.
Queer anarchism, which is challenging heteronormative power structures.
Yeah.
Green anarchism or eco-anarchism, which critiques our exploitation of the environment.
Right.
Black and indigenous anarchisms, which are specifically addressing white supremacy and colonialism.
Wow.
And even anarcho-veganism, which extends the critique to our domination of animals.
So it's like, if it's a system of domination, anarchism has something to say about it.
Exactly. And anarcho-vegan literature often defines anarchism really broadly.
Okay, how so?
It's about opposing all systems of domination and oppression. So that includes racism, sexism, governmental control, capitalism, all of it.
Wow, that's a pretty big tent.
It is. And it's also about promoting things like direct democracy, collaboration, mutual aid, in every aspect of life.
So it's not just about tearing stuff down.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about building something new, something better.
Exactly.
Okay, and a lot of this translates into like actual practices, right? Like
Yeah.
the way people live their lives.
Right. We see this in the formation of intentional communities.
Like communes and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Communities that are consciously trying to live outside the mainstream, outside those dominant systems.
Okay. And this can get pretty radical.
It can. Like with anarcho-primitivism or anti-civilizational anarchism, which basically rejects modern technology and wants to go back to a simpler way of life.
Wow. Okay, so there's a whole range here from like, forming a co-op to like living in the woods.
Yeah, it's a wide spectrum. And we see these attempts to create alternative societies throughout history, right?
Yeah.
Like religious communes, the hippie communes, and now you have like anarchist squats and these temporary autonomous zones.
Right, these spaces where people are trying to create a different way of living, even if it's just for a short time.
Exactly.
And it makes sense that with this kind of nonconformity, you also get a critique of traditional ethics,
Yeah.
like what's right and wrong.
Right. And there's actually a distinction within anarchist thought between radical ethical anarchism, which wants to completely disrupt social norms.
Okay.
And then there's this more like bourgeois anarchism.
Why anarchism?
Yeah, which is more about being free from the state, but not necessarily challenging all the underlying social structures.
Okay, so one is more about personal freedom, the other is more about systemic change.
Exactly. And it's interesting. There's this debate within anarchism about whether it's ultimately based on ethical principles, like a commitment to liberty and solidarity, or if it ends up being kind of nihilistic, where you reject all moral authority.
So is it about building a better world, or is it just about rejecting all rules and constraints?
That's a big question. And what's fascinating from a philosophical point of view is how anarchist thought continues to evolve. It's not just stuck in the past.
Right.
We see it being applied to contemporary issues like intersectionality, multiculturalism,
Right.
and even new technologies like the internet and cryptocurrencies, which are often seen as tools for creating these decentralized systems.
Right, like taking power away from central authorities and giving it back to individuals.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I want to talk about a really important dimension of anarchism that we haven't touched on yet, and that's Black anarchism, indigenous anarchism, decolonizing anarchism.
Right.
These are perspectives that have become really prominent in recent years.
Absolutely. And they offer a really powerful critique of not just the state, but also the whole system of white supremacy and colonialism that underpins it.
Right, because you can't talk about the state without talking about the history of oppression and violence that has led to its creation and its continued existence.
Exactly. And, one of the key insights here is that some pre-colonial indigenous societies had structures that were kind of anarchistic.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, they had decentralized decision-making, communal forms of organization.
Right. But, I mean, we have to be careful not to romanticize these societies, right? Like, they weren't perfect utopias.
Absolutely. It's not about saying that they were perfect, but it's about recognizing that there were ways of organizing society that weren't based on the kind of centralized power that we see in the modern state.
And this is where the idea of decolonizing anarchism comes in, right? Like, recognizing that anarchist thought has often been dominated by white European perspectives.
Right, and these Black and indigenous anarchisms are challenging that, bringing in new voices and new experiences.
And they're making a really powerful argument that the violence of colonialism and white supremacy is inherently tied to the logic of the state.
Exactly. They see white supremacy as the foundation for all of these systems of domination that anarchists are fighting against.
And this leads to some really interesting and radical ideas about blackness itself.
Yeah, like the idea that Blackness, because it's been constructed in opposition to white supremacy, is already kind of anarchistic in its essence.
Whoa.
Because Black people have been historically excluded from the supposed benefits and protections of the state.
Right.
They've been denied the full rights of citizenship. They've been subjected to violence and oppression.
So in a sense, they've always been living outside of the full integration of the state.
Exactly. And a similar argument can be made for indigenous peoples.
Right, because their sovereignty has been denied, their land has been stolen, they've been forced to assimilate.
Yeah. And that's why we see a lot of Black and indigenous activists embracing anarchism.
Right, because they see it as a framework for understanding and resisting the systems of oppression that they've been fighting against for centuries.
Exactly. And this is where someone like Lorenzo Cumboa Irvin comes in.
Right, he was a really important voice in Black anarchism.
He was. He argued that anarchism offered a better path to Black liberation than, say, the Black Panther Party or even Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement.
So he saw anarchism as more radical, more transformative.
Exactly. And this decolonizing impulse within anarchism is really important.
Yeah.
It's about recovering those voices that have been marginalized, those perspectives that have been ignored.
Like Lucy Parsons.
Yeah, Lucy Parsons, she was a formerly enslaved woman who became a prominent anarchist organizer and theorist.
Wow.
And she advocated for anarchism precisely because she saw how the existing system was creating so much misery and suffering, especially for working class people.
Right.
She believed that only a radical anarchist revolution could bring about real change.
So her anarchism was deeply rooted in her own lived experience of oppression.
It was.
Okay, so we've explored all these different forms of anarchism.
Right.
But let's zoom out a bit now
Okay.
and talk about how anarchism is situated within political philosophy as a whole.
Right, because anarchism really challenges some of the most fundamental assumptions of political thought.
Yeah, like what does it even mean for government to be legitimate?
Right. So within political philosophy, anarchism takes the position that there is no legitimate political authority.
Okay.
No government has the right to tell you what to do.
Whoa, that's a pretty radical statement.
It is. And it serves as this baseline, the apolitical condition against which all other political systems are measured.
So it's like, okay, if we start from the assumption that no one has the right to rule, then how do we justify any form of government at all?
Exactly. And it's important to distinguish here between philosophical anarchism and political anarchism.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, philosophical anarchism is about the theory.
Okay.
It's about questioning the very idea of political legitimacy.
Okay.
Political anarchism is about the practice.
Right.
It's about actually trying to create a stateless society.
Okay, so you can believe that no state is truly legitimate without necessarily being an activist.
Exactly.
And as Sims points out, just because you think states are illegitimate, it doesn't automatically mean that you have a moral obligation to overthrow them.
Right.
Like you might have other ethical commitments that influence how you act.
Exactly. It's a complex issue. And, it's interesting to think about the history of political philosophy
Okay.
and where we might find some early seeds of anarchist thought.
Okay, so who are we talking about here?
Well, you can go all the way back to the ancient Greeks,
Okay.
to the Epicureans and the Cynics.
Epicureans and the Cynics.
Yeah, and they didn't have a fully formed theory of anarchism, of course.
Right.
But, Kropotkin himself pointed out that there were some interesting parallels there.
Okay, like what?
Well, the Epicureans, they were all about withdrawing from political life,
Okay.
seeking pleasure and avoiding pain.
So not exactly revolutionaries.
No, not really. But they did see politics as a source of unnecessary trouble. And the Cynics, they were known for their rejection of social conventions, their questioning of authority.
So they were the original punks, basically.
Yeah, kind of. Like Diogenes, the famous Cynic, he mocked political leaders. He tried to deface the currency, meaning not just literal money, but all these artificial values that society upholds.
So they were definitely challenging the status quo.
They were. And Epicurus, he actually advised his followers to avoid politics altogether.
It's kind of like opting out.
Yeah, opting out. And this idea that anarchy leads to chaos, that's exactly what thinkers like Hobbes were responding to.
Right, because he thought that without a strong sovereign, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. And that's what led him to develop his social contract theory.
Right, the idea that we need a strong ruler to prevent everyone from killing each other.
Yeah. And Locke and Rousseau had their own versions of the social contract, too.
But anarchists would say that it's the state itself that creates a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
The violence, the oppression, the corruption.
Right. So the debate really comes down to this. Is the state a solution or is it part of the problem?
And there's a lot of back and forth about this, right?
Right, yeah.
Like, you have Nozick, who argued that even a minimal state is ultimately justified because it arises out of people's desire for protection.
Yeah, his invisible hand argument.
But anarchists like Rothbard would say, no, that's ignoring the actual history of states.
Right.
Which they argue is all about domination and conquest.
Exactly. And even when you look at more sophisticated social contract theories like Rawls,
Right.
Anarchists will still ask, would people really choose to create a state if they were truly free and equal?
And that's where the idea of liberal social contract anarchism comes in.
Right.
Which is, like, can we imagine a social contract that doesn't lead to the creation of a state?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought experiment.
And we can't forget William Godwin. He was a really interesting figure.
Well, yeah, very influential.
Because unlike Hobbes and Locke, he actually argued that government wasn't necessarily better than anarchy.
Right. He thought people were capable of governing themselves rationally.
Yeah.
And he even suggested that historically we've moved from anarchy to despotism.
Meaning that tyranny has been the more persistent problem.
Wow. And Godwin also highlighted this really important point about anarchy.
What's that?
It's not just about individuals being left alone. It can also involve this kind of widespread agreement and cooperation.
Right, like a society based on consensus where there's no need for external authority because everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And this is the ideal that a lot of anarchists are striving for.
Right, like a society of decentralized, self-governing communes.
Okay, so not chaos, but a different kind of order based on mutual agreement and cooperation.
Exactly. And it's worth noting here the connection between anarchism and communism.
Right, because historically, a lot of the big names in anarchism were also communists.
Right, Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin, Goldman.
And they saw these two things as going hand in hand.
Yeah, they believed that a truly free and equal society would also be a communist society. But it's not that simple.
Right.
Because there are also connections between anarchism and free market capitalism.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's not just a left-wing thing.
No, it's more complicated than that. Proudhon, for example, he actually defended a form of communism that was based on decentralized associations and mutual aid.
Okay.
But he was very critical of private property, which he saw as creating despotism.
So it's not about everyone having the same amount of stuff. It's about sharing resources and working together for the common good.
Yeah. And he had this famous quote, "Society finds its highest perfection in the union of order with anarchy."
So order and anarchy aren't opposites. They can actually coexist.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the philosophical arguments for anarchism now, because there are different ways of making the case.
Right. You have these absolute deontological arguments,
Okay.
and then you have more contingent consequentialist arguments.
All right, break those down for me.
So absolute anarchism, it's basically saying that no state can ever be morally justified.
Okay.
Like under no circumstances can a state be legitimate.
All right, so it's a categorical rejection of state power.
Exactly. And this is often based on these, deontological moral principles.
Like, what do we mean by deontological?
Deontological means it's about duties, about principles that are right regardless of the consequences.
Okay.
So, for example, you might argue that individual liberty is so important, so fundamental that any state that violates that liberty is automatically illegitimate.
Right, so even if a state creates a lot of good, if it violates individual freedom, it's still wrong.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you also have these logical critiques of state authority.
Okay, what do you mean?
While you might argue that the very concept of a state is inherently contradictory.
Okay, how so?
Well, take Robert Paul Wolff, for example.
Okay.
He argued that legitimate authority requires both a right to command and a duty to obey.
Okay.
But he said that this clashes with the idea of individual autonomy.
Right, because if I'm truly autonomous, how can I have a duty to obey someone else?
Exactly. And he was influenced by Kant here, the idea of the categorical imperative.
Right.
And he said that the only way a state could be legitimate is if everyone unanimously consented to its authority.
So like a direct democracy where everyone votes on everything.
Yeah.
But he thought that was practically impossible.
Yeah, in any large-scale society, it's just not going to happen.
So he concluded that philosophical anarchism is the only reasonable position.
Exactly. Now, not everyone agrees with Wolff, of course.
Right.
Even some anarchists think he's being too absolutist.
Okay, what are the alternatives?
Well, that's where we get into the contingent argument.
Contingent anarchism.
Yeah. So this is the idea that, okay, maybe a state could be justified in theory under certain ideal conditions.
Okay.
But in practice, states almost never meet those conditions.
Right, so it's not about saying that states are always wrong. It's about saying that the actual existing states are illegitimate.
Exactly. And this is where the empirical evidence comes in.
Right.
Like you can point to the history of state violence, the corruption, the inequality.
All the ways in which states have failed to live up to their own ideals.
Exactly. And you can even combine this with, like, social contract theory.
Right.
You could say, okay, maybe the liberal democratic social contract is a good idea in principle,
Right.
but no actual state has ever actually lived up to it.
Interesting.
And this is similar to what Noam Chomsky argues.
Right, he's a big critic of state power.
He is. And he says that anyone who wants to defend the state has a really high burden of proof.